All right, today's a good one, and I'll probably make a number of people upset. Yet again, I've been doing that quite frequently as of late, but that sort of comes with the territory on this stuff, so it is what it is. Lately, focusing on the topic of finance in particular, it feels like the land of the free and the home of the brave is more like the land of insider trading and the home of corruption. I get it, some people have a visceral, knee jerk reaction to any kind of statement like that, internalizing it as an attack on them personally because of what they believe or who they support politically. But give it a chance because I'm not trying to insult anyone, at least not much, or use antagonistic rhetoric. I'm just trying to lay out the data and ask a few questions. Here goes. Nancy Pelosi. Arguably the poster child now, at least on social media, for the term insider trading, Nancy and Paul Pelosi are a political power couple worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I've actually done a super in-depth video on this before, around 2 years ago, but I want to give a couple of examples briefly to sort of block out the most obvious version of what I'm talking about. Nancy and Paul Pelosi are exceptionally wealthy and incredibly powerful. Paul Pelosi is an investor, and Nancy is obviously a representative in the United States government, former Speaker of the House as well, which comes with a variety of special access permissions. Well, in June of 2022, as per governmental regulations, Paul and Nancy Pelosi disclosed a purchase of 20,000 NVIDIA shares. At the time, it was worth over $3 million. But that purchase, June 17th, if you want to be precise, happened in parallel to Nancy Pelosi spearheading a push for what was called the CHIPS Act, which allocated $50 billion in tax credits and subsidies for American-based technology firms, aka companies like NVIDIA. That is quite obviously a conflict of interest. A husband and wife power couple are buying technology stocks while the wife pushes through tens of billions of dollars in subsidies attached to legislation that she personally helps carry. But it gets even better because after scrutiny began to grow, they ended up selling their shares of Nvidia for a loss. What's interesting to me is that they did this while disclosing the trade on the very same day that it was made, which was the first time in history that they had ever done something like that. Typically, they don't disclose their trades until weeks or months afterwards, and they decided to do this one mere days before the CHIPS Act ended up crossing the president's desk. Strange, right? Why would you ever do that if you had insider knowledge? But it's probably quite convenient if everyone's accusing you of insider trading to take a small loss and then say, look, why would I ever do this? If I had insider knowledge, I must not be insider trading. Sure, but the macro picture here is that more than just NVIDIA or the CHIPS Act, Nancy and Paul Pelosi also held millions of dollars in a company called Alliance Bernstein, which is itself an investment firm holding over $100 million at the time in a company called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. Meanwhile, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House back then, keep that in mind, was traveling across the world visiting Taiwan and meeting for hours on end with TSMC executives. I don't necessarily think I have to spell it out here, but holding millions of dollars in technology stocks or investment firms who hold hundreds of millions of dollars in other technology stocks, while you personally push legislation that gives them tens of billions of dollars in grants and subsidies when traveling across the world to meet their executives in such companies in person that you can be directly financially connected back to and benefit from. It's probably the most obvious conflict of interest I can imagine. And yet, nothing ever happens to stop it. How about another example, if that one wasn't obvious enough? March of 2021, Nancy disclosed a trade buying between $2 and $10 million worth of Microsoft stock. By itself, no big deal, but less than 2 weeks later, Microsoft got a $22 billion contract with the US military. Did she know? Did she not know? I can't say for sure, but we need to remember that markets are typically reacting to what the government does, not the other way around. A very important thing to keep in mind for later. So, someone at arguably the highest policymaking level in the United States government trading stocks which go on to benefit from tens of billions of dollars in subsidies, grants, and exclusive contracts on a regular basis feels like a bit of a problem. How about one more example, okay? May 21st and June 18th, also during 2021, Nancy Pelosi bought Apple, Amazon, and Alphabet. Alphabet owns Google. Interestingly enough, at the exact same time, 6 different bipartisan antitrust bills were making their way through the government pipeline. Antitrust bills would mean disruptions for Apple, Google, and Amazon. But don't panic, because Nancy Pelosi, according to various lobbyist sources, had actually killed antitrust legislation in the past. When the news of these antitrust bills broke out into the broader market, the stock prices actually ended up rising because they had no teeth. They weren't credible. They weren't going anywhere. And looking backwards now, with hindsight, Nancy Pelosi, more like her husband, actually, that's how they separate things off. They say he handles the money and she handles the policy and they never mix. But treating this couple as a joint financial unit, the Pelosis, made yet another perfectly timed set of trades while simultaneously having access to the entire policy-making apparatus of the United States government, which doesn't just mean they have insider information, it means they literally create the forces that influence pricing. It kind of goes without saying, but Nancy and Paul Pelosi massively outperform the rest of the broader market. They continuously find trades that return enormous amounts of money within days or weeks as a direct result of government policy. And sure, you could probably find a way to argue that they're doing it all legally, and perhaps they are. But in my view, that would require the question, why is it even legal to do so? Or how is it legally possible? Because it shouldn't be. Of course, that's just one politician, but the sad reality of this land of the free is that we're not just talking about one politician. We're talking about the entire system. Corruption doesn't grow along party lines, okay? I hear so much whataboutism on this subject, it's honestly just nauseating. But what happens when they're all doing the exact same shit? This is Marjorie Taylor Greene. In some ways, she's the opposite of Pelosi, at least from a raw political perspective, but in others, she's very, very similar. For anyone who isn't aware, she's a Republican congresswoman representing Georgia's 14th district, and I want to start by playing a clip of her being asked a question at a town hall. Here it is.
How do people go to Congress and become multimillionaires in a few years on a $175,000 salary? Mr. Walter, I do not know. I haven't found that money tree up there in Washington or printing machine that they all seem to have. It's amazing, truly amazing. Yeah. Nancy Pelosi, I tell you what, supposedly she has some great stock tips. Y'all should check her out.
That is an incredible thing to say, because Marjorie Taylor Greene, with a congressional salary of $171,000 or thereabouts, is worth an estimated $20 million right now, and executes a tremendous number of stock trades while occupying a position in government. Here's something I found interesting. A lot of publications differ in their estimations of her net worth, but one example would be an AOL piece, which says, quote, her base yearly salary as a member of Congress is $174,000, and Celebrity Net Worth estimates her total wealth at around $700,000, end quote. This was in 2023. But if you check Celebrity Net Worth, it now estimates $20 million. And funnily enough, the website is actually blocked from showing up on the Wayback Machine. I don't know why that is, but it makes it much harder to check what the page used to say. Regardless, estimates of what her net worth actually is are wildly different depending on where you check. Some say tens of millions of dollars when she entered office, others say less than $1 million. But remember, she explicitly joked about the money tree. She hasn't found the money tree up there. Yeah, it turns out directly before Donald Trump announced a 90-day pause on disruptive tariffs, which were decimating the global stock market at the time, Marjorie Taylor Greene made all sorts of different purchases in technology, retail, and finance. She bought into a tremendous number of different companies right before the market fully reversed. And she did this even before the president front-ran his own policy announcement, saying, "Now is a great time to buy" on social media. Of course, Miss Greene says that calls for an investigation into her trading patterns are totally absurd. Obviously, she would say that. But I'm begging everyone in the audience to apply just a tiny bit of objectivity, regardless of whichever political cult you're trapped in. Nancy Pelosi, while occupying a decision-making slot in the United States government, makes millions upon millions, tens of millions of dollars, routinely benefiting from things that seem almost clairvoyant. So much so that it's basically now a joke, where even people like Marjorie Taylor Greene will make comments publicly about it. Meanwhile, Marjorie Taylor Greene makes a huge number of trades while being a political loyalist to the sitting president directly before that sitting president announces dramatic policy changes which wildly impact the entire market. These two things are not monumentally different. I want to make something clear. The issue of financial corruption is not partisan. The problem of insider access crosses the aisle with ease, and it's a problem that is persistently allowed to exist. Far beyond individual politicians, in the immediate moments before President Trump announced a pause on reciprocal tariffs, basically every single major stock index saw extreme levels of high-risk buying. It's not just unusual, it's impossible. I can't sit here and tell you specifically who was responsible for what happened, but I will sit here and tell you that insider trading did occur. People knew, they traded on that information, and they made millions. However, the sad reality of the United States is that in all likelihood, nothing will ever happen to stop it. Let me expand on that. Insider trading is not a new problem, far from it. In fact, in 2012, a bill called the Stock Act, an acronym for Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, was passed through the Senate with a 96-3 vote in favor. The law was designed to curb what was then rampant insider trading on non-public information, but according to Campaign Legal Center, quote, the Stock Act has failed to achieve its goal of penalizing members for insider trading, as no member of Congress has ever been prosecuted under the Stock Act, despite persistent, credible allegations, end quote. Awesome, the enforcement just doesn't work. Cool, but it gets even better. Of the 3 people responsible for voting no on that bill, one of them was a Republican senator named Richard Burr. And it turns out Richard Burr, while simultaneously being the intelligence chair and receiving daily briefings on the COVID-19 pandemic response in 2020, was offloading his stock portfolio, minimizing exposure in key industries before the entire economy collapsed. My favorite thing about this by far was the response. This is what he said. Keep in mind, this is a government insider who is receiving confidential information daily about the state of the nation's pandemic response and upcoming policy. Quote, I relied solely on public news reports to guide my decision regarding the sale of the stocks on February 13th. Specifically, I closely followed CNBC's daily health and science reporting out of its Asia bureaus at the time. Understanding the assumption many could make in hindsight, however, I spoke this morning with the chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee and asked him to open a complete review of the matter with full transparency. End quote. Yeah. Okay, bro. You just X'd out all of the information in your brain that you got from inside the government and watched CNBC for a little bit, and miraculously you decided, oops, time to sell everything, after being one of the only 3 people ever who voted no on a bill aimed at curbing unethical insider trading, because he thinks that Congress should be allowed to do that. In reference to the Stock Act, he said, quote, it's ludicrous. I mean, it's insane. Yes, it is insane that we would want politicians to be restricted from profiting off non-public information, which creates an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Sure, dude, it's ludicrous. In the interest of once again underscoring the bipartisan nature of this problem, here's a couple more lightning-fast examples, okay? Republican Senator Jim Inhofe sold hundreds of thousands of dollars in January, 3 days after a private Senate meeting on the subject, and directly before pandemic policy took its toll. Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time, by the way, sold between $1.5 and $6 million worth of stock from January 31st to February 18th. Of course, the excuse that she used was, it was my husband, not me. But where have we heard that one before? Representative Phil Rowe, Tennessee. This guy sold cruise line shares and bought Zoom, somewhere between $4 and $18 million worth, while also coincidentally purchasing a large amount of Moderna 1 week later, which is obviously a biopharmaceutical company who would go on to be one of the companies responsible for rolling out a vaccine. How about Kelly Loeffler, Republican senator from Georgia, sold between $1 and $3 million worth of stock after briefings about the pandemic, and then purchased shares in teleconferencing and remote work companies. She also married the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange, which is just about as obvious as you can possibly get. Of course, nothing happened to these politicians, any of them. Investigations and ethics inquiries were all dismissed with no charges. But the point I'm trying to make is that representatives in the United States government, many of them, systematically outperform the broader market, with trades and decisions that directly, frequently, and sometimes immediately benefit from government contracts or conspicuously align with insider knowledge, because the land of the free is also becoming the home of corruption. This is the part where I make a certain subset of the audience very angry, but before foaming at the mouth and typing something out, please do me a favor, okay, and just try to answer my question at the end of it all. I said previously that nothing will ever happen to stop it, and that may not be technically true, I hope, but the reason I think that way is because of stuff like this. Setting aside the fact that the president and his wife right now have crypto shitcoins in their name, which have cratered by like 90% or more since the all-time high, which is just insane levels of financial conflict already. Can anyone please explain to me why this is a good idea? This right here is a grant of clemency signed by Donald J. Trump for one Trevor Milton, who is a convicted fraudster that stole over $500 million, that's billion with a B, from investors through a company called Nikola. The company was accused of faking promotional material, securities fraud, wire fraud, you name it. The DOJ actually said that basically nothing surrounding the company was true at all. But now this guy is pardoned because, question mark? The victims of the crime have not received restitution, which means he would now walk away with hundreds of millions in ill-gotten gains. And I'm fully aware of the fact that political dogma is a difficult veil to pierce. But would it change anything if I said that he donated almost $1 million directly to Donald Trump's re-election campaign after he was convicted? And now, coincidentally, he's walking free while he gets to keep the ill-gotten money. Does that make a difference? Of course, before the undoubtedly venomous level of anger in the comments section over the fact that I would ever dare to say this when Biden has done so much worse because of this and that and blah, blah, blah. Yes, he has. Yes, he has. Maybe not worse, depending on who you ask, but just as bad, at least in my view. And for the sake of being thorough, here's an actual example. If you look at the clemency list for the Biden administration, there's a whole lot of people that shouldn't be here, in my view. But I want to draw specific attention to one Rita Crundwell, who it turns out was a city worker, a comptroller more specifically, who stole $53 million of taxpayer money over 22 years to finance a luxury lifestyle. This woman did not deserve a pardon, one of many such cases. So I want to make it clear that when I criticize financial corruption in the United States, I'm criticizing all of it because I do not have blind loyalty to one particular side. Let's go one step deeper here. And to be clear, I'm doing this because A, it just happened, B, it's the current administration, which makes it far more relevant right now, and C, because what I'm about to talk about is the first time in American history where something like this actually happened. Here it is. This is a CFTC press release, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, regarding 3 co-founders of a crypto exchange platform, which requires each of them to pay a $10 million civil penalty. In addition to that, the platform itself, called BitMEX, was fined $100 million for violating the Bank Secrecy Act and for failing to adhere to anti-money laundering laws. Going on a slight bit of a tangent right now, crypto is a cesspool of criminal activity, okay? That is an undeniable fact. Medium to low-level exchanges like BitMEX are an absolute haven for illicit actors, but curbing the usage of crypto for criminal activity is a directly negative thing to do for their business model. Implementing KYC, Know Your Customer, or AML, anti-money laundering protocols, first of all, it's expensive, but second of all, it has a downward impact on the amount of users that they acquire, the number of transactions that they process, and how much money flows into or out of their exchange. So it's kind of like a game of chicken. We do some, maybe a little regulation of ourselves, and if we get caught or prosecuted, we end up paying a fine to the government. Many companies out there simply view this as a cost of business. I don't think anyone's shedding a tear for BitMEX over this. Am I wrong? I don't think average people really care that a dodgy crypto exchange had a fine levied against it as the founders were ordered to pay, a little bit of their massive fortunes in penalties? But Trump cares, and executing a move which is now the first of its kind in this country's history, he not only pardoned the 3 co-founders, but also issued a grant of clemency for HDR Global Trading Limited, which is the parent company of BitMEX. With every single ounce of sincerity that I can muster here, is anyone out there able to articulately explain why a crypto exchange that violated numerous different financial regulations while its co-founders pled guilty to violating the Bank Secrecy Act, can someone please explain to me why it's a good thing that the company, the actual company, not a person, the company, should receive a presidential pardon so that they can avoid paying $100 million in penalties when that money would be directly beneficial to the United States as it currently attempts to tackle a debt problem? Can someone please explain to me why that's a good thing? I would love to hear it. There's a number of additional complexities that I could talk about right now, such as how the Justice Department is now disbanding its crypto fraud unit, or how a presidential crypto token could very easily be used to facilitate bribes, just as a function of what it is and how it works. But the overall point I'm trying to make, which is hopefully not lost in the weeds of brain-dead political fanaticism, is that white-collar financial crime is rampant in the United States government. Regardless of which party in particular is holding the levers of power, personal enrichment, greed, and financial corruption are self-evidently occurring here, with the only difference being who complains about it for the sake of undercutting their opponents. At any given time, one group of lawmakers will very likely be accusing the other group of impropriety and, stealing or financial malfeasance. But the sad reality of these United States is that if you have money, you have different rules. This goes double for the people that actually make the rules, and yet so many people out there blindly adhere to a system where we are good and they are bad. We don't do things wrong, they do. It's them. It's horrible. It's sickening. They adhere to this system simply because the talking points that they most frequently hear tell them to think that way. It's sad. At the end of the day, this video is intended to make people think. The subject matter will almost certainly cause a particular group of people to lash out in the comment section. I'm ready for it. You guys always do. But given the state of the nation that I live in and the fact that these problems appear to be accelerating, I wanted to put my thoughts on paper, or digitize them, I suppose, because that's what this channel is. It is whatever the fuck I want it to be. That's it. If you support what it is that I do, try Locals and Patreon monthly memberships. It is very much appreciated. And those are the platforms also where you can actually reach me personally or send messages and we can chat. Locals and Patreon. There's a special VPN deal as well, merchandise, social media, etc. But I'll cut it there and stop rambling. As always, thank you all for watching, question everything, and have a nice night.